The mall was alive with the sounds of Christmas. Cheerful carols piped through the speakers, children's laughter rang out, and the faint rustle of gift wrap mingled with the hum of 1,000 conversations. A giant Christmas tree sparkled in the center, its ornaments gleaming like tiny stars. The scent of cinnamon and sugar drifted from a nearby bakery, tempting shoppers as they rushed from one store to another, their arms laden with bags. In the middle of this festive chaos was a long line of children, their faces glowing with anticipation as they waited for their turn to meet Santa Claus. Elijah clutched his mother's hand tightly, his small fingers wrapped around hers like a lifeline. He was 7, with bright brown eyes that carried more wisdom than his age should allow, and a shy smile that he rarely showed to strangers. His sweater was old but clean, the threads stretched from years of wear, and his sneakers were scuffed, though polished by his mother's careful hands. He looked around at the other kids in line. Some wore flashy coats, others held shiny toys they'd just unwrapped. But Elijah didn't feel out of place, not with his mom beside him. She always made him feel like he belonged. Nia knelt to his level, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "You ready, baby?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Her dark eyes searched his face for any sign of hesitation. She knew this meant a lot to him, and she wanted to protect that spark of joy in his heart, even if the world tried to dim it. Elijah nodded quickly, his grip tightening on her hand. "I just want to ask for a basketball," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not the fancy kind, just one that bounces real good." Nia smiled, brushing a loose curl from his forehead. "That's a perfect wish," she said. "Santa's going to love hearing that." But inside, her heart squeezed. She didn't have much to give him this year, not with the extra shifts at the hospital barely covering rent, but she wanted this moment to be special. Elijah deserved that. As the line moved forward, Elijah shuffled closer to the front, his excitement bubbling up. His eyes lit up as he watched Santa Claus, dressed in a bright red suit, laughing and posing for pictures with the kids. To Elijah, Santa was magical, someone who made dreams come true. But Nia felt a pang of unease as she studied the man behind the beard. There was something about his stiff smile and the impatient way he gestured to the kids that didn't sit right with her. When it was finally Elijah's turn, he stepped forward, his heart thumping in his chest. Nia stood a few feet back, watching closely. Elijah approached Santa with careful steps, his small hands clasped together. "Hi, Santa," he said, his voice trembling just a little. "I'm Elijah. I wanted to ask for..." Santa, or rather Mr. Whitaker, barely looked at him. He was a heavy-set man with a bushy white beard and a sour expression that seemed out of place beneath the cheerful costume. His eyes flickered over Elijah's worn sweater and scuffed shoes before narrowing. "What do you want, kid?" he interrupted, his tone sharp. Elijah hesitated, taken aback. "A basketball," he said quietly. "I'd really like a basketball." Whitaker let out a low chuckle, but there was no warmth in it. "A basketball, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Well, let me tell you something, kid. We save the gifts for the kids who really deserve them. Maybe try again next year if you've done something worth earning it." Elijah's smile faltered, the light in his eyes dimming as Whitaker's words sank in. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The chatter of the crowd faded, and all Elijah could hear was the thud of his own heartbeat. Nia was at his side in an instant, her arm wrapping protectively around his shoulders. "That's enough," she said, her voice calm but firm, her gaze locking onto Whitaker's with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You don't talk to a child like that." Whitaker shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "It's the truth," he said, his voice dismissive. "You can't just go around handing things out to everyone. Where's the lesson in that?" Around them, the crowd had started to notice. Parents exchanged uneasy glances, and a few children whispered to each other, their wide eyes darting between Elijah and Santa. The festive cheer of the mall seemed to dim, replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. Elijah tugged at Nia's sleeve, his voice trembling. "It's okay, Mama, we can go." But Nia crouched down, looking him straight in the eye. "No, baby," she said, her voice softening. "It's not okay. You didn't do anything wrong. You asked for something simple and kind, and that man," she glanced back at Whitaker, her expression hardening, "forgot what Christmas is really about." Whitaker rolled his eyes. "Save the lecture, lady," he muttered. "If you've got a problem, take it somewhere else." Nia stood up slowly, her posture straight and unyielding. She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried a weight that cut through the room. "My son is not the problem here," she said. "Maybe you should think about why you're sitting in that chair if you can't even show a little kindness." Whitaker opened his mouth to respond, but the murmurs of the crowd had grown louder, and he seemed to think better of it. Nia turned to Elijah, her hand on his back. "Come on, baby, let's go." As they walked away, Elijah kept his head down, but Nia held hers high. The crowd parted for them, some people nodding at her with quiet respect. She caught snippets of their conversations. "That was uncalled for. Poor kid. I can't believe he said that." But she didn't stop. She wouldn't let Elijah see her frustration, her anger, her sadness. She wouldn't let him carry that burden. When they reached the exit, Elijah finally looked up at her. "Mama," he said, his voice small, "was I bad?" Nia's heart broke at the question, but she didn't let it show. She knelt in front of him, holding his face in her hands. "No, baby," she said, her voice firm. "You are good, you are kind, and you are more than enough. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." Elijah nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Nia pulled him into a hug, holding him close as the cold winter air brushed past them. Over his shoulder, she looked back at the mall, at the man in the Santa suit who had tried to steal a piece of her son's joy. Her jaw tightened, and a quiet determination settled over her. She whispered into Elijah's ear, her voice steady and strong. "We'll show them who we are." Nia adjusted her scrubs in the mirror, tucking loose curls under the edges of her hairnet. The reflection staring back at her looked tired, lines around her eyes from too many late nights, a shadow of exhaustion that no amount of coffee could chase away. But beneath that weariness was something stronger, something that kept her moving forward every single day. She wasn't doing this for herself. Everything she did, every shift she picked up, every step she took, was for Elijah. She glanced at the clock, its hands racing toward the end of her double shift. Her feet ached, her back felt like it was holding the weight of the world, but her heart pulled her forward. Elijah was waiting for her. He was always waiting. When she got home, the small apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of Elijah's pencil scratching against paper. He sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his homework, his tongue poking out in concentration. The light above him flickered faintly, and Nia made a mental note to fix it, another thing to add to the never-ending list. But seeing him there, so focused and determined, filled her with pride. "Hey, baby," she said softly, setting her bag down. Elijah looked up, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Mama." He jumped up and ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His hug was warm and tight, and for a moment, the weight of her day melted away. "You finish your homework?" she asked, smoothing his hair back. "Almost," he said, pulling her toward the table. "I was waiting for you. I need help with this one." He pointed at a math problem, his brows furrowed in frustration. Nia smiled, pulling out a chair. "Let's take a look." As they worked through the problem together, Nia marveled at how much he reminded her of his father. Elijah had the same intensity, the same quiet determination. His father, James, had been a man who believed in hard work and kindness, a man who had left a legacy in their community, both on and off the basketball court. He'd been a local legend, the kind of player who made you believe in magic when the ball was in his hands. But more than that, he was a good man, a loving husband, and an even better father. Losing James had been like losing a part of her soul. The day he passed, it felt like the world had stopped spinning, like the air had been sucked out of the room. But even in the depths of her grief, she had looked at Elijah and found a reason to keep going. James had given her the greatest gift of all, her son, and she was determined to honor his memory by raising Elijah to be just as strong, just as kind, just as unshakable. "Done," Elijah said, breaking her thoughts. He held up the workbook, a triumphant grin on his face. "See? Told you could do it," Nia said, ruffling his hair. He laughed, then grabbed a worn basketball from the corner of the room. "Can we go play now?" he asked, his eyes lighting up with excitement. Nia hesitated. She was bone-tired, every muscle in her body screaming for rest. But the way he looked at her, full of hope and joy, made it impossible to say no. "All right," she said, grabbing her coat, "just for a little while." They headed to the park down the street, the cool evening air biting at their cheeks. The court was empty, the sound of the ball echoing off the pavement as Elijah dribbled and shot. He was good, really good. His movements were quick and fluid, his aim sharp. Nia watched him, her heart swelling with pride. "You've got your daddy's hands," she called out, and Elijah beamed at the compliment. As the ball swished through the net, he ran over to her, panting and flushed. "Mama," he said, his voice serious, "do you think I could be as good as Dad one day?" Nia knelt down, cupping his face in her hands. "Baby, you can be anything you want to be. Your daddy would be so proud of you. I know I am." Elijah grinned, his eyes shining. "I'm gonna be the best," he said confidently. "Just wait and see." The memory of that night lingered in Nia's mind as she stood in line at the grocery store a few days later. She was flipping through coupons when she heard the cashier's voice, sharp and dismissive. "Ma'am, I told you already. Your card isn't working," the cashier said to an older woman in front of her. The woman looked embarrassed, fumbling through her purse. Nia stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "I've got it," she said, handing over a bill. The cashier raised an eyebrow, but took the money without comment. The older woman turned to Nia, her eyes welling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Nia smiled. "It's nothing. Have a good day." As she loaded her groceries into the car, her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her coworkers. "Guess who's Santa at the mall this year? Mr. Whitaker. Be careful." Nia frowned. She didn't know Mr. Whitaker personally, but his reputation preceded him. He was known for being gruff, stuck in his ways, and not exactly welcoming to people who didn't look like him. The thought of him interacting with kids, especially kids like Elijah, made her stomach twist. When Elijah heard about the mall Santa, he was thrilled. "Can we go see him, Mama? Please?" he begged, his eyes wide with excitement. Nia hesitated. She wanted to protect him from whatever ugliness might be waiting, but she also didn't want to crush his joy. "All right," she said finally. "But remember, baby, no matter what anyone says, you are worth more than gold. Don't forget that." At the mall, the line to see Santa was long, the air buzzing with excitement. Elijah held her hand tightly as they waited, his eyes darting around at the decorations. When it was finally his turn, Nia hung back, watching as he approached Mr. Whitaker. The interaction was brief, but it left a sour taste in her mouth. Whitaker barely looked at Elijah, his answers curt and dismissive. Nea's jaw tightened as she watched her son's shoulders slump. When Elijah returned to her, his face was a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "What happened, baby?" she asked gently. "He didn't even listen," Elijah said quietly. "He just said I should ask for something realistic." Nia's heart broke, but she kept her voice steady. "Don't you worry about him," she said. "Some people forget what kindness looks like, but we don't, do we?" Elijah shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "No, Mama, we don't." As they left the mall, Nia glanced back at Whitaker. His expression was smug, his posture rigid. He thought he'd won, thought he'd diminished her son's light. But Nia knew better. Justice had a way of finding its moment, and she would be ready when it came. The gym buzzed with energy as parents and kids filled the bleachers, their chatter echoing off the high walls. The charity basketball event was the talk of the town, a chance for young talent to shine and raise money for local programs. Elijah stood near the court, holding his basketball, his fingers brushing the smooth surface like it was a trusted friend. He glanced around nervously, taking in the crowd. Nia knelt beside him, her hands steadying his shoulders. "You've got this, baby," she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise. "Just go out there and have fun. Show them what you can do." Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. "What if I mess up?" Nia smiled, her eyes full of pride. "It's not about being perfect, Elijah. It's about giving your best, and I know your best is enough." The announcer called his name, and the crowd clapped politely as Elijah stepped onto the court. His small figure looked even smaller against the backdrop of the towering hoop, but he squared his shoulders and dribbled the ball with confidence. The other kids on the court were bigger, older, but Elijah moved with a grace that made the ball seem like an extension of his hand. As the game began, it became clear that Elijah was special. He darted between defenders, his small frame allowing him to slip through gaps with ease. His shots were precise, each one drawing gasps and cheers from the audience. Nia watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with every basket. For a moment, the weight of their struggles seemed to lift, replaced by the joy of seeing Elijah shine. But not everyone was impressed. Mr. Whitaker stood near the refreshment table, his arms crossed, his face sour. He had been assigned to oversee the event as part of his Santa duties, though he clearly resented the task. Watching Elijah steal the spotlight seemed to grate on him more with every cheer from the crowd. When Elijah made a particularly impressive three-point shot, the gym erupted into applause. Whitaker shook his head, muttering under his breath. "Show off," he said loud enough for a few nearby parents to hear. Coach Ramirez, a broad-shouldered man with a warm smile, stepped up beside him. "That kid's got talent," he said, nodding toward Elijah. "He's got a bright future if he keeps at it." Whitaker snorted. "Talent's not enough. These kids get handed everything these days. Privileged handouts, that's all it is." Ramirez frowned, his smile fading. "I don't see anything being handed to him. He's out there earning it, just like anyone else." Whitaker shrugged, his gaze fixed on Elijah. "We'll see how long that lasts. Flashy moves don't mean much in the real world." Nia, standing just a few feet away, heard every word. Her jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She walked over, her steps deliberate, her eyes steady. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through their conversation. "Do you have something to say about my son?" Whitaker turned to her, his expression a mix of annoyance and surprise. "Your son," he said, glancing toward the court where Elijah was still playing his heart out. "I was just making an observation, nothing personal." "It sounds personal to me," Nia said, her tone sharp but controlled. "My son works hard for everything he has. If you can't see that, maybe you're not looking close enough." Whitaker raised an eyebrow, his posture stiffening. Look, lady, I'm entitled to my opinion. And my opinion is that this whole event is more about making people feel good than recognizing real skill. Coach Ramirez stepped in, his voice firm. That's enough, Whitaker. These kids are here to learn and grow. It's not about tearing them down. Whitaker smirked, leaning back against the wall. You can call it what you want. I call it reality. Nia took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. The reality is that you're using your bitterness to tear down a child. And for what? To make yourself feel better. My son doesn't need your approval, and he certainly doesn't need your negativity. For a moment, the tension between them was palpable. Whitaker opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of the buzzer interrupted him. The game was over, and Elijah was being surrounded by his teammates, their hands slapping his back in congratulations. The crowd clapped and cheered, their energy washing over the court like a wave. Whitaker glanced at Elijah, his jaw tightening. Well, good for him, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Let's see if he can keep it up when it actually matters. Nia didn't flinch. She stepped back, her expression calm but unyielding. People like you don't scare me, she said quietly, and they don't scare him. You'll see. As Whitaker turned away, Ramirez looked at Nia, his eyes filled with admiration. You handled that better than I would've, he said with a chuckle. Nia smiled faintly, her gaze still on Elijah. I've had practice. The event wrapped up, but the air between Nia and Whitaker crackled with unresolved tension. As she helped Elijah pack up his things, she caught Whitaker watching them from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but Nia didn't care. She had faced bigger challenges than him, and she wasn't about to let his bitterness dim Elijah's light. As they left the gym, Elijah looked up at her, his face glowing with pride. Did you see me, Mama? He asked. Did you see the three-pointer? Nia smiled, pulling him into a hug. I saw, baby. You were amazing. Elijah beamed, his earlier nerves forgotten, but as they walked to the car, Nia's mind lingered on Whitaker's words. She knew men like him didn't change easily, and she had a feeling this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. But for now, she focused on Elijah's joy, letting it fill her heart like a warm flame. Whatever came next, she was ready. The whispers began as soon as Elijah left the court. He was tired but happy, clutching his basketball under one arm as he walked past groups of adults huddled in quiet conversation. Their voices weren't meant for his ears, but the words floated toward him anyway, sharp and impossible to ignore. Can you believe Whitaker? Still bitter about that game all these years later, one man said, shaking his head. Another laughed softly, but it wasn't a kind sound. Bitter. The man's obsessed. That loss cost him everything. Of course, he hates seeing kids like Elijah succeed. Elijah slowed his steps, his heart pounding. Whitaker. That name again. The man who had humiliated him at the mall and dismissed him at the basketball event. Elijah knew there was something more to Whitaker's cruelty, but now, hearing the adults talk, the pieces started to click. He ducked behind a row of chairs, pretending to tie his shoe, and strained to catch the rest of their conversation. You remember, don't you? One of the men continued. Whitaker was the big star back then, the one everyone thought would make it big. But that one game, what was it? Regionals? He blew it, and against James Taylor of all people. Elijah froze, his father. I heard he still blames Taylor for ruining his shot at the pros, another voice chimed in. Says if it weren't for that game, his life would have been different. But come on, it wasn't Taylor's fault Whitaker missed that last shot. The men laughed, their voices fading as they moved further away, leaving Elijah with 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. He stood up slowly, gripping his basketball so tightly his knuckles turned white. His father. Whitaker hated him because of his father. By the time Elijah and Naya got home, he couldn't hold it in any longer. As soon as the door closed behind them, he turned to her, his eyes wide with urgency. "Mama, did Dad beat Whitaker at basketball?" Nia froze mid-step, the question hitting her like a wave. She set her purse down carefully, her face unreadable as she turned to face him. "Why are you asking about that, Elijah?" "I heard some people talking," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "They said Dad beat him in a game, and that's why Whitaker is so mean. Is it true?" Nia sighed, sitting down on the couch and patting the seat beside her. Elijah joined her, his basketball still clutched in his hands. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "It's true that your father and Mr. Whitaker played against each other a long time ago. It was a big game, and your dad's team won. But Elijah, that doesn't mean it's your fault, or your dad's, that Whitaker is the way he is." Elijah frowned, his fingers tracing the lines of the basketball. "But why does he hate us, Mama? I didn't do anything to him." Nia's heart ached at the frustration in his voice. She placed a hand on his knee, her touch gentle but firm. Some people, when they lose something important to them, they hold onto that pain for a long time. Instead of letting it go, they blame others. It's not right, and it's not fair, but it has nothing to do with you, baby. That's his burden, not yours. Elijah nodded slowly, but the questions still lingered in his mind. Later that night, when Nia was asleep, he grabbed his tablet and began searching for anything he could find about his dad and Whitaker. Articles, old photos, grainy videos of the legendary game, they all painted the same picture. His father had been a hero on the court, a leader who inspired his team to victory. Whitaker, on the other hand, was described as a hotshot who crumbled under pressure. The final video Elijah found showed the last seconds of the game, Whitaker missing the shot that could have won it, and his father sinking the winning basket moments later. Elijah stared at the screen, his emotions a whirlwind. Pride swelled in his chest as he watched his father celebrate with his team, but anger burned just as brightly. Whitaker wasn't just mean, he was holding onto a grudge from before Elijah was even born. It felt unfair, almost ridiculous, that this man's bitterness was directed at him. The next day, Elijah couldn't hide his frustration. At breakfast, he barely touched his food, and when Nia asked if he was okay, he just shrugged. She watched him carefully, her mother's intuition telling her something was brewing. As he grabbed his basketball and headed for the park, she made a mental note to keep an eye on him. At the park, Elijah practiced with a fierceness he hadn't felt before. Every dribble, every shot was filled with purpose. He wasn't just playing for fun anymore, he was playing to prove something. He imagined Whitaker watching him, imagined sinking basket after basket, while the man looked on, powerless to stop him. "Nice shot," a voice called out, breaking his concentration. Elijah turned to see Coach Ramirez approaching, his whistle hanging around his neck. "You've been out here for a while. Everything okay?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded, "Just practicing." Ramirez studied him for a moment, then sat on the bench nearby. "You know, practice is good, but playing with that kind of intensity, it's like carrying a weight on your back. What's going on, kid?" Elijah bit his lip, debating whether to say anything, but something about Ramirez's kind eyes made him open up. "It's Whitaker," he admitted. "He hates me because of my dad, and I don't know what to do about it." Ramirez leaned back, nodding slowly. "I heard about that. Your dad was a great player. A great man too. Whitaker, well, he's stuck in the past. He let that game define him, and he's been carrying that chip on his shoulder ever since." "It's not fair," Elijah said, his voice rising. "I didn't do anything to him, and my dad didn't either. He just played the game." "You're right," Ramirez said. It's not fair, but you can't control what Whitaker thinks or how he feels. All you can control is how you respond. You've got a gift, Elijah. Don't waste it trying to prove something to someone who doesn't deserve your energy." Elijah nodded, the coach's words sinking in, but even as he dribbled the ball again, a part of him couldn't let it go. Meanwhile, Naya was quietly working behind the scenes. She had posted about the mall incident on social media, not expecting much beyond a few supportive comments from friends. But the story had taken on a life of its own. People were sharing it, adding their own stories of run-ins with Whitaker. Some defended him, saying he was just a grumpy old man, but most were appalled by his behavior, especially toward Elijah. The post caught the attention of a local reporter who reached out to Nia for an interview. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to put Elijah in the spotlight more than he already was. But the reporter was persistent, and Nia realized that shining a light on Whitaker's actions could make a difference, not just for Elijah, but for other kids who might face similar treatment. As the story spread, the community began to rally around Elijah. Parents reached out to Nia, offering their support. A local basketball league invited Elijah to join, waiving the fees. Even strangers sent messages of encouragement, telling Elijah to keep his head high and keep playing. But the attention also brought more pressure. Whitaker, now aware of the growing backlash, doubled down on his arrogance. He dismissed the story as exaggeration, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. "People these days can't handle the truth," he told a colleague. "If being honest makes me the bad guy, so be it." The tension between Elijah and Whitaker simmered, each day bringing them closer to another confrontation. Elijah tried to focus on his game, on the love of basketball his father had passed down to him. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whitaker's bitterness wasn't just about a game, it was about more than that. And Elijah knew that if he wanted to move forward, he'd have to face it head-on. The mall buzzed with excitement as families flooded the wide corridors, their arms weighed down with shopping bags. Christmas lights twinkled overhead, casting a warm glow that masked the icy tension lingering near the event stage. Today's fundraiser was meant to bring the community together, to spread joy and showcase young talent. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Elijah stood backstage, clutching his basketball. His stomach churned with nerves, but his mother's voice echoed in his head, steady and calming. "Play your game, Elijah. Don't let anyone dim your light." He breathed deeply, glancing at the crowd beyond the curtain. Whitaker stood at the microphone, his red Santa suit freshly pressed, though his expression betrayed his distaste for the role. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying a forced cheeriness that fell flat. "Thank you for supporting today's fundraiser. Let's hear it for all the performers who've given their time and energy to entertain us." The applause was polite but tepid, the crowd's energy muted by his lack of warmth. Whitaker's eyes scanned the audience before he continued, his tone dropping. "And now, for the final act of the day, we've got Elijah Taylor." He said the name as if it left a bitter taste in his mouth, his lips curling in disdain. "Let's see what the little guy can do." The crowd clapped again, louder this time, as Elijah stepped onto the stage. He felt every pair of eyes on him, their expectations heavy on his small shoulders. Whitaker leaned into the microphone and added, almost offhandedly, "Let's hope he doesn't drop the ball." A few murmurs rippled through the audience, but most people ignored the comment, focusing instead on the boy standing center stage. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to tune everything out. His mother was in the front row, her smile steady and reassuring. He dribbled the ball a few times, feeling its familiar rhythm under his hand. Then he began his routine. At first, it was simple, basic dribbles, spins, and passes to himself. But as he gained confidence, the tricks grew more daring. He dribbled behind his back, spun the ball on his finger, and bounced it off the stage floor with pinpoint precision. The crowd leaned in, their murmurs turning into cheers. By the time he launched the ball into the air, caught it mid-spin, and sank a perfect shot into a makeshift hoop, the entire room erupted into applause. Whittaker's face darkened. He clapped half-heartedly, his jaw tight. "Not bad," he said into the microphone, his voice laced with sarcasm. "For a kid." His words hung in the air, heavy and sour. Nia's eyes flashed with anger, but she stayed seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elijah, oblivious to Whittaker's jab, bowed to the audience. As he walked off stage, Coach Ramirez greeted him with a high five. "That was incredible, kid. You've got a gift." "Thanks, Coach," Elijah said, his smile wide but shy. Back at the microphone, Whittaker tried to regain control of the room. "All right, folks, let's give one more round of applause for all our performers today," he said, his voice strained. He avoided looking at Elijah as the boy passed by, his fists clenched at his sides. But then, it happened. As Whittaker turned to leave the stage, someone from the crowd shouted, "Why can't you just admit he's good?" The room went silent, all eyes shifting to Whittaker. He stopped in his tracks, his back stiffening. Slowly, he turned to face the crowd, his face a mask of irritation. "Ishan, what are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "I've seen talent, real talent, and trust me, this isn't it." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, discontent rippling through the room. Whittaker's carefully constructed facade was cracking, and he knew it. "You all want to pretend he's some kind of prodigy, fine, but don't expect me to jump on the bandwagon just because." He stopped himself, but it was too late. The implication in his words hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Nia stood slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. The crowd parted as she stepped forward, her gaze locked on Whittaker. "Just because what, Mr. Whittaker?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. "Go ahead, finish your sentence." Whittaker faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. The room was deathly silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. "I don't have to explain myself," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "No, you don't," Nia said, her voice rising just enough to carry. "Your actions speak louder than your words ever could, and what they're saying is loud and clear." The crowd erupted into whispers, some nodding in agreement, others looking at Whittaker with fresh scrutiny. Whittaker turned away, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He stalked off the stage, leaving the microphone dangling from its stand. Later, as the event wound down, Nia stood with Coach Ramirez and a few other parents, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. "It's already trending," one of them said, showing her the screen. A video of the confrontation had been uploaded online, the caption reading, "Mall Santa exposes his true colors." The comments were pouring in, most of them condemning Whittaker's behavior and praising Nia for standing up to him. Nia sighed, her emotions a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. "This isn't just about us," she said. "It's about making sure no other kid has to feel the way Elijah felt." Ramirez nodded. "You've got the community behind you, Nia. Whittaker's not going to get away with this." As they talked, Elijah approached, his basketball tucked under one arm. "Mama," he said quietly, tugging at her sleeve. "Did I do okay?" Nia knelt down, pulling him into a hug. "Baby, you did more than okay. You were amazing." Elijah smiled, the weight of the day lifting slightly, but as they left the mall, hand in hand, Nia couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whitaker might have been exposed, but she knew men like him didn't go down without a fight. She tightened her grip on Elijah's hand, her resolve stronger than ever. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The grand hall glittered with lights, each chandelier casting a warm, golden glow across the crowd. The Christmas Eve Gala was the event of the year, a spectacle of holiday spirit and community pride. Families mingled, children laughed, and the air buzzed with excitement. At the center of it all was the charity basketball game, the crown jewel of the evening, meant to inspire the next generation of athletes while raising money for underprivileged kids. Elijah stood at the edge of the court, clutching his basketball, his palms damp with nervous sweat. This was his moment, but somewhere in the crowd, Mr. Whitaker lurked, his presence a dark cloud over an otherwise brilliant night. Elijah scanned the audience, searching for his mother. When he spotted her near the front row, her steady gaze met his, and she gave him a small, reassuring nod. He swallowed hard and tightened his grip on the ball. He could do this. He had to do this, not just for himself, but for her, for his dad. Whitaker, dressed in his Santa suit but stripped of all cheer, lingered near the refreshment table, his face set in a scowl. The fallout from his previous actions still hung over him, but he hadn't given up on his petty vendetta. He'd spent the past week spreading rumors, whispering to anyone who would listen. "The kid's overrated," he'd said. "Just another showboat who'll burn out before he even gets started." Some believed him, others didn't, but Whitaker didn't care. He wasn't about to let Elijah steal the spotlight again. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, silencing the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for the Christmas Eve Gala. Before we begin the game, let's take a moment to celebrate the amazing talent we have here. Tonight's event is about community, hope, and the power of perseverance. Please give a warm welcome to our youngest participant, Elijah Taylor." Applause erupted as Elijah stepped onto the court, his heart pounding. He looked out at the sea of faces, some smiling, some skeptical, all waiting to see what he could do. But one face stood out, Whitaker's, twisted in barely concealed contempt. Elijah took a deep breath, blocking out everything else. This was his stage now. The game began, and Elijah's nerves melted away as soon as the ball hit the floor. He moved like water, weaving between players with a fluid grace that drew gasps from the crowd. His dribbling was sharp, his passes precise, his shots effortless. Every move he made seemed to defy his age, his size. The audience leaned forward, captivated by the boy who played like he had something to prove. Whitaker watched from the sidelines, his jaw tightening with every cheer Elijah earned. He couldn't stand it, the way the crowd adored the kid, the way he seemed untouchable. Desperation clawed at him, and he made his way to the event organizers, his voice low and urgent. "This is a mistake," he said. "You've got people rooting for a kid who doesn't even belong here. He's a distraction, not a real player." One of the organizers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, frowned at him. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "Elijah earned his place here. The audience clearly thinks so too." Whitaker bristled. "Audience opinions don't matter. Talent does. And I'm telling you, that kid isn't as good as he looks. You're setting him up for failure." But before the woman could respond, a voice rang out from behind them. "Funny, I don't remember you being the expert on what makes a real player." The crowd turned, murmurs rippling through the room. A tall man in a crisp suit stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. Nia gasped softly. "That's Darnell, right?" she whispered to Elijah. "He was on your dad's team." Darnell strode onto the court, the microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and powerful, "I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but I can't stand by and let someone tear down a kid with this much heart and talent." Whitaker froze, his face paling. He hadn't expected this. Darnell turned to him, his expression hard. "You remember me, don't you, Whitaker? We played against each other in that big game years ago. You were good, real good, but you weren't great. You know who was? James Taylor." The crowd murmured, and all eyes shifted to Elijah. James was the kind of player who didn't just win games, he inspired people, Darnell continued. He lifted his teammates, treated his opponents with respect, and left it all on the court. You lost to him, Whitaker, fair and square, and instead of learning from it, you've spent decades letting that loss define you. Whitaker's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room was too still, the weight of Darnell's words hanging heavy in the air. Darnell turned to Elijah, his expression softening. "Your father was a great man, Elijah, and watching you play tonight, I can see that greatness lives on in you." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause echoing off the walls. Elijah's cheeks flushed, but he stood taller, his heart swelling with pride. Nia stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her tone steady and unwavering, "you've spent so much time trying to tear my son down, but tonight, the truth speaks for itself. Your bitterness doesn't define us, it doesn't define Elijah, and it won't define this community." The audience roared their approval, their support for Nia and Elijah growing louder with every second. Whitaker stood frozen, his face red with humiliation. He glanced around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The walls he'd built around himself were crumbling, and there was no way to stop it. The event organizers stepped in then, whispering quietly among themselves. Moments later, one of them approached Whitaker, their expression firm. "Mr. Whitaker, we appreciate your time, but it's clear that your presence here is no longer welcome. Please leave." The crowd watched as Whitaker stumbled off the court, his shoulders hunched, his head down, his reign as Santa, and as the self-proclaimed arbiter of who belonged, was over. As the game resumed, Elijah played with a freedom he hadn't felt before. Every dribble, every pass, every shot was a testament to his resilience, his talent, his heart. When the final buzzer sounded, the crowd erupted into cheers, chanting his name. Later, as they walked to the car, Nia held Elijah's hand tightly, her heart full. "You did it, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You showed them who you are." Elijah looked up at her, his eyes shining. "We did it, Mama," he said, "together." The mall was quieter now, its festive decorations glimmering under dimmed lights as the last shoppers filtered out. It was hard to believe that just days ago, this place had been filled with cheers for Elijah and murmurs of disdain for Whitaker. The echoes of that night still hung in the air, a mixture of triumph and unease. Elijah sat at the edge of the stage, his basketball resting on his lap, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. Nia watched him from a few feet away, her arms crossed but her face soft with understanding. She had seen that look before, the way he stared at nothing, lost in thought. It was the same expression James had worn after tough games, the kind that left you questioning everything but strengthened you in the end. She walked over and sat beside him, her presence grounding. "What's on your mind, baby?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. Elijah shrugged, his fingers tracing the lines of the basketball. "I don't get it, Mama," he said quietly. "Why did Mr. Whitaker hate me so much? Why did he hate Dad? Dad didn't do anything wrong." Nia took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes, when people feel like they've lost something, they look for someone to blame. Your dad was a good man, Elijah, a strong man. But to Whitaker, he was a reminder of what he didn't have. That doesn't make it right though. It just makes it sad. Elijah nodded slowly, but the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. Do you think he'll ever stop being mean? I don't know, Nia admitted, resting a hand on his shoulder. But what I do know is that you don't have to carry his anger. That's his burden, not yours. You've already shown him who you are, and that's more than enough. Elijah looked up at her, his small face filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. You think so? I know so, Nia said firmly. She pulled him into a hug, holding him close as if she could shield him from all the bitterness in the world. And no matter what happens, we've got each other. That's what matters most. The next morning, the fallout from the gala was everywhere. Social media was ablaze with videos and commentary, the story spreading like wildfire. Clips of Darnell Wright calling out Whitaker's grudge and Nia's powerful stand were being shared across platforms, each one accompanied by messages of support for Elijah and condemnation for Whitaker. The hashtags #Justice for Elijah and #Mall Santa Scandal were trending, and the mall management had no choice but to take action. By midday, Whitaker's resignation was announced. The press release was brief, stating that he had stepped down from his role due to recent controversies. But everyone knew the truth. He had been forced out. The man who once sat on his throne in a Santa suit, passing judgment on children, was now a figure of public shame. For Whitaker, the days that followed were a blur of humiliation. He couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of people's stares, their whispers slicing through him like knives. At first, he tried to justify his actions, muttering to himself that he had been misunderstood, that people didn't know the full story. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had let his bitterness consume him, and now he was paying the price. It was a week after the gala when Whitaker finally decided to face the music. He arrived at Nia and Elijah's apartment unannounced, his hat clutched nervously in his hands. He hesitated before knocking, his heart pounding in his chest. When the door opened, Nia stood there, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice steady but guarded, "what are you doing here?" I need to talk to you," he stammered, his usual arrogance replaced with a nervous humility, "and to Elijah." Nia considered him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Elijah was sitting on the couch, flipping through one of his basketball magazines. When he saw Whitaker, his eyes widened, and he instinctively moved closer to his mother. Whitaker felt the boy's wariness like a punch to the gut. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Whitaker said, his voice thick with emotion. "To both of you. I've done a lot of thinking since the gala, and I realized how wrong I've been. I let my anger and my pride get the better of me. I took it out on you, Elijah, and that wasn't fair. It wasn't right." Elijah looked at him, his young face filled with a wisdom beyond his years. "Why were you so mad at me?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Whitaker swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Because you reminded me of everything I lost," he admitted. "Your dad, he was everything I wanted to be. And when I couldn't beat him, I let that failure define me. I was wrong to take that out on you. I see that now." Nia watched him carefully, her arms crossed, but her gaze softer than before. "Words are a start, Mr. Whitaker," she said, "but actions are what matter." Whitaker nodded, his head hanging low. "I know. I hope one day, you'll both be able to forgive me." Elijah glanced at his mother, and she gave him a small nod. Turning back to Whitaker, he said, "I'll try." The moment was quiet but powerful, a small step toward redemption. Whitaker left the apartment with a heavy heart, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope that he could change. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally around Elijah and Nia. The mall announced a new Santa program, one that celebrated diversity and inclusivity. Families from all backgrounds were invited to participate, and the new Santa, a kind, jovial man who greeted every child with genuine warmth, became an instant favorite. The change was a symbol of progress, a step toward healing. For Elijah, the support from the community was transformative. He walked into the park one afternoon to find a group of kids waiting for him, their faces lit with excitement. "Show us some tricks, Elijah," one of them called out, holding a basketball. Elijah grinned, his confidence growing with every cheer, every word of encouragement. He dribbled the ball with ease, spinning it on his finger before launching it into the hoop. The kids erupted into applause, their admiration lifting him higher than any trophy ever could. That night, as Nia tucked him into bed, Elijah looked up at her with a smile. "Mama," he said, "do you think Dad would be proud of me?" Nia leaned down, brushing a curl from his forehead. "Baby, your dad would be so proud of you, and so am I." Elijah closed his eyes, his heart full. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged, not just on the court, but in the world. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew that no matter what challenges came his way, he had the strength to face them. Because he wasn't just playing for himself, he was playing for something bigger, something that mattered. The sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon with streaks of amber and pink. The neighborhood park, once a place of quiet gatherings, now buzzed with energy. Dozens of kids raced up and down the basketball court, their laughter blending with the rhythmic thump of basketballs on concrete. Parents sat on the sidelines, watching with a mix of pride and nostalgia as their children chased dreams of slam dunks and three-pointers. Elijah stood at the edge of the court, his presence magnetic. At just 8 years old, he was already a local legend, his talent undeniable and his humility even more remarkable. "Elijah, show us that spin move again," a boy called out, his voice filled with excitement. Elijah grinned, grabbing his ball and dribbling it with practiced ease. He spun it on his finger, then crossed it behind his back before sinking a shot from the free throw line. The kids cheered, their admiration glowing in their wide eyes. "You're so cool," a little girl exclaimed, clutching her own basketball like a treasure. Elijah laughed, the sound light and free. "It's all about practice," he said, handing her the ball. "You try now." As the kids took turns mimicking his moves, Nia watched from a nearby bench, her heart swelling with pride. It had been months since the Christmas Eve gala, months since Whitaker's resignation and the uproar that followed. In that time, so much had changed. The mall had overhauled its Santa program, replacing it with a team of diverse, welcoming figures who celebrated every child who visited. Community events now focused on inclusivity, with activities that highlighted the importance of kindness and respect. And Elijah, her Elijah, had become a symbol of resilience and hope. "Elijah's got them all inspired, huh?" Coach Ramirez said, sitting down beside Nia. He held a water bottle in one hand and a clipboard in the other, his ever-present whistle dangling from his neck. Nia smiled, nodding. "He's doing more than I ever dreamed. It's like, he's not just playing basketball anymore. He's showing them what's possible." "That's the power of a kid with heart," Ramirez said, "and a mom who never gives up." Nia chuckled softly, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "He's got a lot of his father in him," she said quietly. "James would have been so proud." Ramirez nodded, his gaze following Elijah as he guided a younger boy through a dribbling drill. "He would have, but you should be proud too. You've done something incredible here." As the sun dipped further, the lights on the court flickered on, casting a warm glow over the players. The younger kids began to filter out, their parents calling them home for dinner, but a few teens lingered, watching Elijah intently. One of them, a tall boy with a skeptical expression, stepped onto the court, his basketball tucked under his arm. "Hey, Elijah," he called out. "You think you're so good, huh? Let's see what you got." The court fell silent, all eyes on Elijah. The challenge hung in the air, heavy with tension, but Elijah didn't flinch. He smiled, stepping forward with his ball. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's play." The game was quick but electric. Elijah's speed and precision were unmatched, his every move met with gasps and cheers from the crowd. By the end, the older boy was panting, his hands on his knees, while Elijah stood tall, his victory undeniable. "Man," the boy said, shaking his head, "you're the real deal." Elijah grinned, holding out his hand. "You're good too. Let's play again sometime." The boy hesitated, then shook his hand, a small smile breaking across his face. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Naya watched it all, her heart full. This wasn't just about basketball. This was about community, about breaking barriers and building bridges. A few weeks later, Nia and Elijah found themselves standing outside a community center, its walls adorned with murals celebrating local heroes. Tonight was a special night, a ceremony honoring James Taylor and his legacy. The event had been organized by the community, a testament to the lasting impact James had left behind. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by familiar faces, friends, neighbors, even former teammates of James. The room buzzed with warmth and love, the walls lined with photos and memorabilia from James's basketball days. Elijah stared at the displays, his eyes wide with wonder. "Mama," he whispered, tugging at her hand, "that's Dad's jersey." Nia smiled, her own eyes misty. "It sure is, baby. He wore that the day he won the championship." As the ceremony began, speakers took the stage, each one sharing stories of James's kindness, his determination, and his unwavering belief in lifting others up. When it was Nia's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with a steady grace, her hand resting on Elijah's shoulder. "James Taylor was more than a basketball player," she began, her voice strong but tinged with emotion. "He was a husband, a father, a friend, and a role model. He believed in the power of community, in the importance of giving back. And tonight, I see that same spirit in my son, Elijah." The crowd erupted into applause, their admiration for Elijah palpable. Nia glanced down at him, her smile widening as she saw the pride in his eyes. After the ceremony, a man approached them, his face familiar yet aged with time. "Nia," he said, his voice soft, "it's been a long time." Nia's breath caught. "Coach Daniels," she said, her voice breaking, "I didn't think you'd come." "I wouldn't miss it," he said, his gaze shifting to Elijah. "You've got your dad's fire, kid, and his heart. He'd be proud." Elijah beamed, his chest swelling with pride. For the first time, he felt like he truly understood the legacy his father had left behind, not just on the court, but in the lives he'd touched. As the night wound down, Nia and Elijah stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. They stood beneath the stars, the world quiet and still. Elijah looked up at his mother, his face glowing with joy. "Mama," he said, his voice soft but certain, "I'm going to make Dad proud. I'm going to be the best I can be." Nia knelt down, cupping his face in her hands. "You already have, Elijah. You already have." And as they walked home, hand in hand, the stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, a testament to the resilience, love, and hope that had carried them through it all.